Welcome to the latest in our internal controls over financial reporting webcast series, and this is the perfect storm of where business process and financial control meet identity and access. So thank you very much for joining us. I am very pleased to report that I am indeed Dan French, founder and CEO of Consider Solutions. I'm the one on the left. I do sometimes look happier than that. I'm very pleased to be joined by two giants, if not titans, of the industry. We have Hans van Ness, our COO at Consider Solutions, and welcome, Hans.
Hello, Dan.
And welcome to Mike Sims, who's VP of Identity and Access Management Advisory and Architecture at Herjavec Group. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Dan. Pleased to be here.
So that's that's us. That's today's discussion. Here's the agenda. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the 6 key challenges to ICFR integrity and the role they have in significant deficiencies. And we kind of introduced this at the last webcast with Robin Ashby, who's head of internal controls at Curate and QVC. I'm going to ask Mike to talk a little bit about identity and access management from the insider perspective. Hans is going to talk to us about the confluence of IAM and ICFR. I'm going to come back with some thoughts to the road, and there'll be some questions. This is going to be 45 minutes in total. Please ask questions as we go through. There is a question panel on your GoToWebinar interface. Please use it at will. Any ideas, any questions, any thoughts, pop them in as we go through, and we'll try to deal with them at the end. If you have any technical questions, as some of you already worked out, you can use the same panel to solve that problem as well. So that's our agenda. Little bit of context. Many of you know us. The Consider Solutions kind of viewpoint and context is all about helping organizations drive to world-class operations, world-class financial results. And you can see that on the left, which is pretty obvious: how to drive better business results, reduce cost of operations, optimize cash flow, and have better risk management. And the pillars in which we deliver that on the right, very much focused today on financial control and compliance and its underpinnings with technology and data. And these are some of the this is some of the company we keep. These are the global influences, organizations that some of the organizations that work with us, and they also stimulate us to come up with some challenging content and answer some challenging questions. So thank you all for that. So got 3 polls for you today, just to make sure you keep active and involved. First one's really simple. It's how would you define your role? How would you describe yourself? And there's only 5 options. I had to keep it short. Would you regard yourself primarily as the internal control or internal audit? And I know shouldn't really have those together, but for the purposes of number 5, we had to. 2, would you self-describe primarily as finance? 3, as an identity and access management specialist. 4, in a broader IT or AS role, or 5, other. Just one of those. How do you self-describe? Give it a go. Should be pretty straightforward, just so you know who you're amongst, and we can gauge how to see the answers to the other questions. So it's just how you describe yourself. It's not necessarily what's on your business card or your email footer. Just how do you describe yourself? Let's have a look. So very significant. Best part, 2/3 of you internal control or internal audit, which is to be, I guess, to be expected, and just under 10% on identity and access management. So that's great. So now you know who you're with. So setting the scene. We did a bunch of research, and we also plugged into some other significant research from Deloitte and others. And we've been noticing this anecdotally, but it's very obvious now from the research that a big percentage of the major public companies around the world have had 1 or more significant audit deficiencies in the past 2 years. And these are, as those of you who've had that know, it's painful experience, and that's a big number, and it's getting bigger. And these are a big challenge, and we have been making massive investments in digitization, and you tend to assume we'd kind of be sorting a lot of that out as a byproduct, but it don't seem to be doing that. A lot of the new kind of leading cloud ERP solutions you'd assume would help it, but it's not really coming through in the results. And in our webcast 6 weeks ago with Robin, we asked about 300 or 400 people on that webcast to what extent has audit attention to ICFR in your organization changed in the past 3 years, and only about 15% of those people said it was it had got better. Everyone else said it was at least as bad or getting worse. So I think there's some evidence there. ICFR, internal controls over financial reporting. I love this image. It's simple. It relates the financial statement, the financial report, the significant counts in that financial statement through to business processes that flow through to deliver those, the transactions that make that happen, the financial applications that support them, and the infrastructure that underpins those. And obviously all this relates to the COSO cube there on the top right, which you will all know. And then this idea of IT general controls on the left-hand side and process and application controls on the right-hand side. And I think that's just kind of a nice, helpful picture. In our last webcast, we asked everybody, as I say, there are a few hundred of them, we asked them, what in your view and experience is the single biggest challenge in ICFR SOX compliance transformation? And this is a word cloud from their responses. I'm going to be asking you for one at the end of this also. And you can see kind of a bit of some of the trends and tendencies there. So the bigger the word, the more it was referred to. So that kind of little bit of introduction for you. But what we did find, what did come out of the research is there are 6 major challenges around internal controls over financial reporting now, which are definitely barriers to success. The first one is this whole issue of the fact we're moving more and more to end-to-end business processes, not just functional activities, but end-to-end business processes of the like I'm showing here in source to pay, or whether it's customer to cash or whatever. And of course, these are global geographically, they're global business-wise, they reach all the business units, they touch a lot of different stakeholders, and also they touch a lot of different technologies. So that's a big issue. The process issue is definitely making a difference. The second big challenge is that we have been focused very much on control. Certainly the SOX focus has been very much control focused, and I think we've learned in recent years to be much more risk aware, and that controls are there to implement policy and mitigate risk. But the fact is, a lot of organizations, because it's getting more complex, this challenge of not dealing with it as a process is becoming more acute. So the circle here, the virtuous circle of risk to policy to control to monitoring and action, I think it's an important way to think about it. So if you don't integrate that, you want to be integrating it because it causes you problems. And the end-to-end cycle there of risk to perform, as you can see, is yet another global process. And in major organizations, if you do need a process, if you want to coordinate and make this work and have the governance that delivers. Another big challenge is the technology shifts. Now, it wasn't long ago where the ERP was everything, but there's been a noticeable shift in recent years, partly from the cloud ERP vendors, but this idea of, rather than monolithic ERP with a few ancillary things, this idea of a hub and spoke architecture. So we have the governance architecture on the left and the application architecture on the right, with a core ERP very much focused on the financials and process-specific applications around the outside. Now that is changing things because it reflects the end-to-end processes, and it means we've got a much more complex world to deal with. And it doesn't get easier because if you're involved in M&A, or if you've got business units around the world, and you've got the geography piece, you've got this duplicator, which makes it even more complex. And we heard many times that this is getting very, very painful. So challenge 4 was very much about manual controls. Now you'd think in this day and age, we're in 2021, you would assume that most of our controls will be automated by now, but it's absolutely not the case, and there's lots of good reasons for that. But this is a survey from Deloitte that nearly half the respondents of global organizations said that less than 10% of their key financial controls are automated. And you can read the rest of that yourself, but it's chilling, but it's true, right? If you look at your chart of controls or your control framework, there's an awful lot, for necessary reasons, is manual or hybrid, but not fully automated. And we did some polls through LinkedIn about the biggest single concern related to internal controls over financial reporting and where you spend most effort and cost. And manual process controls were way up there ahead of everything else. So that probably isn't a surprise to you, but it's definitely something that we need to address, because it's not going to help us in the world of agility we're trying to get to. And to make matters worse, and Robin at our last webcast talked about this, is there's no real standard for a lot of these things. So what do you mean by an automated control? We asked 200 to 300 people on the last webcast, and there was differences of opinion about what an automated control is. Well, if you haven't got a common definition of it, no wonder we're in having a bit of a challenge, and you can work that out yourself. So challenge number 5 is governance. Obviously, governance about the way in which we make decisions, we drive accountability and drive execution, absolutely critical. But we know in a global business, there are these lighthouses. There are slightly different objectives by function and by process. And the job of governance is to try and bring that together and have a common way to drive this, bring the lighthouses together. Now, the IAA have made good effort in dealing with that with their 3 lines model, and you've all seen that. But actually making governance work in a global business, in a large business, multi-BU, multi-geography, all the rest of it, requires a lot of skills and a lot of effort across business units, functions, processes, geographies, technologies, and all the rest of it. So governance is a big issue. And then the 6th key challenge was that of identities, users, and interactions. Now, we all know the whole cycle here of the joiners, movers, leavers cycle through the organization, but of course it's not just permanent staff, it's subcontractors, it's business process outsourcers, it's business partners, it's customers, it's suppliers. It's getting far more complex, and we map that onto this much more complex technology architecture, and it's no surprise that the world of identity, usage, and interaction is getting more complex. So we have this continuing evolution of the IDM, the privileged access management, the identity governance administration world, trying to deal with all that as well. So no big surprise, but those are 6 key challenges. We've dealt with some of them. Today we're very much focusing on identities and user access, and no better way of introducing Mike Sims as this particular lead off into IAM expert view. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. As I said, I'm very pleased to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all those on the call. Quick intro of the company I work for and myself after that as well. So, work for a company called Hirschevek Group. Some of you may have heard of them. They were founded in Canada, so they were certainly the largest cybersecurity company in Canada, but have since moved into North America and the rest of the world. They are leaders in cybersecurity, so they handle all areas of cybersecurity, everything from SIM to security operations centers, to intruder attacks, pen testing, and of course identity and access management, which is my area. They often get recognized as one of the leaders in that managed security space, also pioneers in virtual SIM solutions. So they're one of the first to offer those solutions as a service in the cloud, which back then was probably seen as unique, but in the ever-changing world, I think they were spot on. So myself, I'm the VP of IAM Advisory and Architecture within Hirschevek Group. I've spent, I'd say, the majority of my career in identity management or identity and access management. If we go on to the next slide, Dan, and in that time I've been working in that space, I've really seen a shift in the products. So going back as far as the late 90s or the very early noughties, IDM was very much about provisioning. It was a technical challenge. It was about controls. It was about automation. And we've certainly seen a big shift over the years. The mid-noughties with the emergence of Sarbanes-Oxley, there's certainly more of a business challenge in identity management or identity governance. And there's a lot of vendors and a lot of products out there, as you can see there, and they spread out across different product areas, but with significant overlap, as you see there. So it can be, to a sense, confusing. So, you've also probably got a circle to represent, SSO and access management as well. So a lot of different vendors there. We work with a lot of those vendors, and certainly the traditional identity management vendors are still there and playing in that space. But as I said, certainly from a governance and an audit and compliance point of view, we're seeing a big shift we've seen a big shift in that direction, and it continues to go that way. Certainly, there's not one product to fit all. That said, those that read the media and the news, you may be interested to see, the name Okta in the middle there, who were traditionally seen as an access management player, dealing with sort of external identity or authentication. They are now very boldly going into both the governance space and the PAM space. So very interesting to see where they go with that. They're certainly going to be a very big player in all 3 spaces. On to the next slide. So what is it? What do we do? Identity access management. I think a lot will be familiar with it. I wanted to share with you, our sort of maturity slide here. what are we aiming at solving with IAM controls? And I think you can see, our maturity model and scale. This is typical. You might have seen other vendors and other organizations representing it. I would say, our emphasis for me has always been moving away from the unaware. So you obviously, to have good controls, you need to be aware, have good visibility. And in order to sort of drive that maturity, you need to move to, first of all, putting controls in place so you can react to some of the risks and the dangers within your organization. But where possible, you should be looking to be proactive in that. So stopping the risks, stopping the dangers before they can even occur. And then, moving forward to the future and optimizing that. There's so much more new technology coming. There's more use of machine learning and artificial intelligence and big data and various other tools and techniques that's really going to help us optimize those tight processes and controls and automations. With all those things set in mind, certainly Hirschfeld Group and my focus has always been in 3 key areas. One is obviously security, so to have better risk controls and really to stop intruders and bad malicious attacks. But combined with that, there is an efficiency challenge. We want to reduce work. Dan mentioned earlier about manual processes. Adding automation, really can not only tighten up those processes, but include, reduce the cost and improve operational efficiency. And the other one that often gets forgotten for me is the user experience that really glues it all together. I think that really drives business adoption. There's no point in trying to invest in a solution that your customers or your internal employees really don't like to use, because they will circumvent it if they can. So we really have to tie that together with a good user experience. So that's the IAM maturity. I think it probably fits into a much larger picture in terms of overall security maturity. And I'm sure Dan will have something to say on that later. Moving on to, again, the tools that I talked about on that first slide and kind of a typical architectural model that we present to some of our customers in terms of, how do we use those tools together to increase and mature our IAM architectures. So if you concentrate on the middle segment of these, or the middle column of these slides, or middle row of these slides, you'll see 3 main areas that I certainly deal in. So authentication on the far left, that is your single sign-in solutions, your MFA solutions, providing things like risk-based auth, step-up authentication, second factor authentication like tokens and mobile devices, and really the authorization of that as well. What can they do once they have been authenticated? So products such as Okta, I've already talked about. We work a lot with Ping. CA SiteMind is a product that's been on the market, pretty much since the conception of that area, and we work closely with them. The middle section, this is probably my favorite area. It's the area I've been most intimately connected with and worked in, is the identity governance. So that includes some identity management, the joiners, movers, leavers that Dan also talked about. Now, we often refer to that as JML, and as he rightly said, it is more than just JML. There's so many other processes that actually feed off that get forgotten. Access recertifications, again, with the emergence of SOX, audit and compliance is number one. It's not just about being able to see it, it's about being able to show accountability for, who has access to what. Role-based role management, so RBAC, access requests, the self-service element, and the password element as well. So that's really an area that, hugely on the user experience, but also on the automation and productivity, self-service and reducing help desk calls through password management and portals. And finally, on the far right, privileged access management. It's been a hot potato for so long in our industry. It's about identifying those, individual privilege accounts. It's about identifying those system or service accounts, or even bots and machine accounts, machine-to-machine accounts. How does that feed into your actual applications and the things you're trying to protect? And it's quite interesting. And the products that we use, they do integrate directly with that. And it's very interesting to see, we buy these products and we implement them, but really, where are our challenges in making those integrations and using them to interact with our systems? And if we can move on to the next slide, Dan, I just wanted to touch on, where I saw the biggest challenges today and what I continuously hear when I talk to customers. So, top challenge number one, identities, as I already alluded to, and with that, ownership and business adoption. So very often for IT controls, it's a process that maybe starts, with procurement and within IT, and that's maybe correct, but I think that also opens up one of our biggest challenges, because if it's a process or an application purely controlled by IT, it doesn't drive the business adoption, and it doesn't really highlight the risk and the risk associated with those financial controls. So the first thing is we need ownership, we need application ownership, we need process ownership, we need role ownership, because that's really who owns those controls. Another huge challenge, and it's becoming a bigger challenge just with the drive to cloud adoption, is the scope. So in the past, IDM products looked at internal access controls, right? An identity was an employee. Now that is, it was never fully the case, and it's getting harder to control, because now not only do internal people sit outside the perimeter with more and more remote working, we also have to consider short-term staff, contract staff, temporary staff, outsourced staff, suppliers that come in and work with you, and almost most importantly, your customers. Almost all businesses have an element of customer identity management to think about as well. Last challenge, along with scope, is the granularity. Again, looking at the way we traditionally approach identity management, we took a handful of endpoints or platforms, and we tried to tightly integrate with those endpoints. We looked at doing fine-grained access control. We looked at doing fine-grained provisioning, where everything from a role or entitlement level could be pushed and provisioned. How successful were we in doing that? I would say 10, 15 years ago, a handful of us were successful and the majority were not. And to really meet the SOX requirements, we had to take maybe a more business view on it, and maybe a more pragmatic approach, where we concentrated on the visibility of that access first. Let's see what everyone has and build some controls, such as user access reviews on that first of all, put some segregation of duty or some rules around that, and then look to building those fine controls over time. Now, what I'm seeing now is the velocity of that, we're getting left behind, because with cloud adoption, the perimeter is moving, and it's moving quickly. The number of apps outside your organization is now outweighing the number of apps inside your organization. So do we need to change our approach a bit? Do we need to maybe look at using OpenID Connect or even SAML as a way of auditing how people are accessing our applications, instead of tightly coupling and getting in to the old traditional ways? And how does IAM or IGA fit in with the slide that Dan mentioned earlier? Interestingly, I think the traditional the traditional IDM systems I talked about was very much far on the left-hand side. It was all about IT controls, and it was all between the applications and the infrastructure. I think over time, the products, the products like SailPoint and Avexa, they did venture into the space on the right-hand side and looked at putting controls in from a business process point of view. But the challenges I talked about on the previous slide, are we addressing it far enough up, this scale or this nice diagram we have here, or are we concentrating too much at the bottom and the actual infrastructure level in terms of implementing those financial controls? And I think that really draws into how do we integrate with ICFR? Where do we put the controls in place? And this is a suggestion, but it really seems like an obvious progression, that we should really be extrapolating or putting a sort of persistence layer between the products that we bring in to manage it and the end result. And that's the measurable areas of risk, right? Because when you combine authentication and IGA into roles and everything else, and then you try and put that or define it as an application or a business process, that's really starting to identify not just the risk on a single transaction, but a risk on the actual things you're trying to do, the business processes. So, how you can do that, there's several different ways. You could be passing provisioning requests back to the IGA solutions or the identity management solutions. You could be looking at using another product. You could be looking at, workflow products or pure provisioning products, and actually choosing the right product for what you're looking at. You could be using the, as I say, the identity authentication products to do some of this as well. So quite interesting, how we design this in terms of architecture and how we move forward. But really, when I talk to Dan, the thing that we both agree on is there is a massive elephant in the room, I guess, and that's what this pictures really signify. But traditionally we saw it as two different areas, and actually there is a massive overlap, and there is, I think, an agreement we have to come to how we can combine, transactional traditional IDM with, ICFR and the wider picture and the business focus. And yeah, happy to hand back over now to Dan and Hans, but also happy to take questions on the end around this.
Thanks very much, Mike. That's a great talk through the IAM and IGA landscape. Just before I hand over to Hans, as I say, I'm sure you've got questions already, so do pop those questions into the GoToWebinar interface on your tablet, laptop, or phone, whatever you're using. There's some interesting stuff coming up already, so please make your questions. But with that, I'll hand over to Hans to talk about this intersection between IAM and internal controls over financial reporting. Hans.
Thanks, Dan. I agree with Mike. There is at one hand a gap, and the other hand an overlap, and there is a need to adjust the worlds that we traditionally are seeing in this space. To the left, I have a little circle where I put in the control, the user behavior, and the attestation. And for argument's sake, I would call that the GRC circle. And to the right, I have the circle that Mike presented with the IDMs, the PAMs, and the IGAs. What you see is in fact that both those circles use different lighthouses. And I took this analogy from Dan's introduction. The lighthouses are having a function to guide you to the safe harbor, but the lighthouses are from the two circles are pointing in slightly different directions. And I tried to summarize that by showing the little breakdown list of the topics that are typically addressed with that element. They have something in common: identities. They all need identities. Business processes need identities, ICFR, to activate the processes, to control them, to interact, as Mike explained. And yes, it's getting more and more complex, and especially the fact that you have non-human is giving a bigger problem, because you have to worry who's behind the automated identity or set of identities or group of identities, and how do we control those massive automated processes, maybe including artificial intelligence. If we look at the elements, the views that make up the IAM and access control and process control world, I've drawn this picture, and starting from the middle section from the right, there is a business view where you define business roles. You have to run risks because you have to operate a company. You define controls to make sure that those risks are addressed in a proper way, and you end up with the need to give access to people. And from the top, you have the identity view of things, where you start with the identities, the identity in the context of an application, in the context of an application role, and maybe within that role with certain limits for that role, maybe thresholds on how big it is within that role. And last but not least, from the bottom up, you have the application view of things. Talk about functions or transactions, data actions, action logging, and in the end, the value of a change that you made that gives the state of your data. If you look from the IAM side, typical technical landscape provisioning, as Mike said, that's the way it started, and it went further and further down the road. It introduces, it includes indeed roles to a certain level, typically not limits. The application side of things, you see that it was largely focused on getting it provisioned, getting the users the access. And typically they somewhere in the logging section. As far as logging is switched on for or switched off for performance reasons, I always say with a little smile. And they are not so interested in the resulting value of the activity. They just store it. The process is more important. And then if you look at access and process control, they essentially do a full circle of those elements. Of course, limited in the sense that they only at the access and process control for applications that are seen as having most of the time financial risks embedded, and of course they also look only at the identities that play a role in that risk and the applications that play a role in that risk scope. So having this view in mind, and turning back to ICFR, we need some convergence in our opinion. We need conceptual integration between the IAM world, the controls world, the user behavior world, and also the attestation world, because as Dan said as an introduction, there will be a lot of manual controls around, even if we do our best to automate as much as possible. And attestation is always the completing element in this conceptual integration idea. If you move that now to the ICFR picture that Dan and Mike were using, I would advocate that we adapt that model a bit, and we remove, in my opinion, at best the IT and the process and application controls side skirts, as I call them. We replace them by a more holistic risk management block where we combine all the relevant policies, process and application controls, and IT general controls, including the IAM solutions, in one holistic view to make sure that we cover all relevant elements in a coordinated. So that was, in fact, the idea of moving into ICFR, and that is now finally said. But how do you get there? Because we can agree that this is necessary, but how do you realize it? Mike gave some indications. I will go a bit deeper into to our ideas about that. And you could say that there are two main topics. Simplified topics for integrated risk management and GRC. They have largely been focusing on the process and access controls within the application scope. And IAM, as Mike already explained, came from the infra side and has largely eaten up now also the application side to a certain level. And we think that we should bring together the two lighthouses of the two worlds so that they point to the same safe harbor. And we see two convergence routes emerging in this space. We call it first, we have two vendor routes, and we call it vendor routes because it's driven by the vendors that are innovating. And it overlaps a bit with what Mike has stated. But we see some of the IAM vendors always, they already have enough GRC-like functionality in there to cover that area also. Advocated, but in our opinion, not often realized, and in our opinion also granularity-wise not deep enough. Just a bit of evidence on the side on that. One of the most prominent IAM vendors has just bought a GRC vendor to their earlier advertised coverage of the GRC side. This is a very viable route, which we think is also very viable, is driven by some of the big ERP vendors. They started with delivering GRC functionality on top of their ERP, but they want more of the customer cake, and they have added more and more IDM and IGA like elements to it. which is all fine, but you have to watch out because it can give limitations if you are in a multi-vendor hub and spoke landscape, as Dan explained. But could be viable where you're very much focused on one ERP vendor. There is also vendor route 3, and I put it in here for completeness reasons. You could call it the marketing and sales route. Often it started with reusing customer-specific solutions and gluing them together and throwing them together in a basket. We really would advise don't go there, because without a solid underlying architecture, you will build up your technical. And there is a fourth route, and we call that a user route because it emerged from the desire of organizations to have a more pragmatic interaction between IAM and GRC worlds. So worlds apart, you look which elements are covered best by which circle in this case. You make sure that they communicate about the same things and houses in such a way that you have a cleaner, better, and probably also cheaper. So this fourth route we like to call a narrow path IAM, and it is focusing on reuse what you have in your house, both at the GRC side and at the IAM side, and at the HR data side, everything that you have already. Make sure that you have a common architecture, a common agreement who is doing what best, and where to stay away in certain areas for it. You can augment that, as I said, with a lot of other elements floating around in the organization. We have seen very few organizations where our related data can be found, and organization-related data can be found in one spot. So you might have to combine a few things. Have you done that, then you can also decide between the GRC and the IAM block how to go about cross-system violations, self-service options, and make sure that you mask and automate the complexity where possible. And I have a simple, well, maybe not so simple initially if you look at it, but a good example of how this could work. This is based on the Info Risk and Compliance GRC suite that communicates with the IAM world to find out if the identities are there or if the identities should be deprovisioned. It communicates with the HR system to make sure that any HR change triggers the necessary access request elements. And in the end, after the approval process and the approval process is becoming much more complex, because it's not traditionally only the IT person anymore who decides on access, but the process owner or even a local manager who is involved in that process. If that approval is given, then the provision to the systems in the risk scope is triggered automatically. It's just an example of how this could work. Of course, depending on what you have in your own organization, your picture would look a bit different. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Hans. Thank you very much, Hans. That's a great talk through the routes and how to bring IAM and ICFR together. I've got a few thoughts and a couple of things for you, so it's important the last few minutes. Keep your questions coming in, please, because they will be useful to you and us, I'm sure. So just to bring ourselves back to the context here. There were 6 key challenges. We're talking very much about identities and user access. Hopefully you've really grasped, both in your own personal experiences and in the insights and experiences of Mike and Hans, the real kind of challenge here in bringing these worlds together. I've got a couple of quick polls for you, because given what you've heard, I would like you to think about how would you characterize your current approach to identity, access, IT general controls, and ICFR as 4 pillars? and pretty simply just characterize it. We've got one common management and governance structure for all 4 pillars. 2, we've got a common governance structure, but the pillars are managed separately. 3, all 4 pillars are managed separately with some level of coordination, or 4, they're managed in isolation, and 5, I don't know. This is going to be helpful, I think, for you to see the kind of the general trends, because there's a lot of you with us today, so this is going to be an interesting, statistically relevant sample. There's 560 people who signed up for this, and so there's a reasonable sample here. So would you say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? So 5, if you don't know, that's easy. It's number 5. So you have, in terms of these 4 pillars of identity, access management, IT general controls, and internal controls over financial reporting, which will have a slightly different lighthouse, to use Hans's terms. You have one common management governance structure that covers all of them. That's 1. 2, you have a common governance structure overall, but the pillars are managed separately. 3, all 4 pillars managed separately with some coordination. 4, all pillars managed as silos. Oh, I don't know. Let's see what we got. So, okay, so most of you are in the, okay, it's 2 and 3 are the most dominant, and I understand quite a lot of you might not know. That's fine. So thank you for that. One more question for you. So this is to do with the technology architecture, which Hans started to talk about. So this isn't about the governance of the process, it's about the technology architecture itself, but it's a similar question. Do you have a common architecture to support all 4 pillars using the integration approach, the vendor-driven approach? Do you have 2, one common architecture to support all 4 pillars, which is the interaction approach that Hans described? 3, separate architecture and technology for each pillar, but some level of coordination. 4, separate architecture and technology for each pillar, but it's siloed. There's no value judgment on this. It's just interesting to understand where you're all at. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Don't worry, the last complicated question for you. I think it's fairly obvious given the context of what we've discussed. So if you can make a judgment on that. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So 1 is you're integrated across all 4: identity, access management, granular access control, IT general controls, and your financial controls. 2, you've got a technology architecture, but there's a loosely coupled interaction of the type that Hans described. 3, you've got separate architecture and technology for each pillar, but there's some level of human coordination. And 4, we just do our own thing and hope for the best. Let's have a look, see what we got. So, right, so this is coordinated. That doesn't surprise me, that's really interesting. So significant, the majority of you, or the biggest single group, have a separate architecture and technology for each pillar, but it is coordinated. Okay, thank you for that. Hope you found that useful. We're going to share this afterwards. So coming back to Mike's architecture slide, and sorry, maturity slide, we talked about the 5 levels of maturity, and it's really, really important, and those are powerful descriptions he gave. But if we look now at this bigger landscape we're dealing with in business, we've got to take this maturity model to deal with, you know, the enterprise risk management perspective above the control layer. We've got to look at enterprise end-to-end business processes, and we've got to have enterprise governance. So our whole view of the scope of this maturity model has suddenly expanded. So, you know, there's a lot more to come in this, but I think hopefully you've gathered from what we've talked about is we've got to move up from just control. We've got to be risk enabled, we've got to be enterprise process enabled, and supported by enterprise governance. So I think it's interesting to kind of give ourselves a bit of a helicopter view on this. So in terms of thoughts for the road, I'll just give you some ideas here. I mean, Hans and Mike even is a really good pointer to the fact we've got to do some new thinking. We've got to think out of the box a bit. So is it time to refresh our approach to risk management and control across the piece and all the pillars? Can we identify and align all the stakeholders of all those different pillars, and can we bring them together? We know all these technologies are bound in every organization, so how do we exploit what we have and replace what needs to be replaced and mature as we need to mature? And then Hans's question, is the integration or interaction the right strategy for us? There's pros and cons, as Hans described. We've got to work that out. And sometimes a significant deficiency, the SOX deficiency, the audit comment, is the necessary catalyst. It's a painful, ugly road. But sometimes you just need that to bring all the stakeholders together. If you can do it without, I'd certainly recommend it. But sometimes that's just a necessary catalyst. So worth thinking about. So Hans gave us a really great update on this ICFR picture with an integrated risk management view. We've talked about the end-to-end business processes. We've talked about the financial applications and the business applications in the hub and spoke architectures. We've talked about the kind of COSO focus around risk and controls. And we talked about identity playing in both the risk management world and the infrastructure world. So kind of this is kind of something for us to hang our hat on a bit. Now, we talked in our last webcast, we're running a series of sessions here. Last webcast was what's the shape of your deficiency, your next deficiency. This has all been about the perfect storm. We're coming back in the coming weeks with the manual hybrid control governance discussion, another massive issue. And we're thinking, we're going to be sharing also a case study from one of our clients on how you think differently in this world. So I've got a couple of questions for you. I'm going to take a couple of very quick questions, but right at the end, when we finish this off, I want to ask you just to type some thoughts in the panel. So I want you to think about, from what you know yourself and what you've heard today, what do you think is the single biggest challenge in managing identities, users, access, and interaction? And when we finish this off in a couple of minutes, you're going to see this go to webinar, it's going to close, it's going to finish, and then you're going to get this, and it's going to, you click this close button, and then you're going to get a button. So please look out for this panel. You're going to get another window, which is going to give you this little panel to ask you this question. And I'd ask you in very, very few words, can you just put the key words that you think are the single biggest challenge? And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to bring it back to you as a word cloud, as we did in the last one. And it's a kind of a useful way of thinking about the problem, and it also helps make a form of collaboration over this. So don't forget that. So we have got a couple of questions. I know we're late, but I did start late. So I've got to have a couple of very, very quick questions for you. What we got here? So I've got one here for, right. Premise of this session is that issues are getting worse. I understand the points you make, but why is it getting worse? So I get your point. So I think I made the observation earlier that we used to be very ERP centric, and but the scope of systems now is really increasing with this hub and spoke architecture. The end-to-end processes is kind of adding an extra level of complexity on that, and so we've got this greater ambiguity about identities and users and the management of them. So this is why one of the reasons why I believe, and the observations are, that's why it's getting worse. It's just because we're shifting our view of processes and technology and the people who are accessing it. Question here for you, Mike. The maturity model you showed, we are at level 2, aware. That's the aware phase. How long does it typically take to get to the level 3, the reactive stage? Got any thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, sure. Great question. Obviously, there's not going to be one answer for all. I think great that you're at the aware stage. That means you're keeping your auditors happy. But I think my advice there would be, think big and think long. So don't be surprised if this is a multi-year program. Don't try and squeeze everything in the next 8 to 12 months. Really, because businesses need time to adopt to the processes you put in place, and that does take time. So typically, it could be anything between a 1 year to a 3 year program to fully complete that journey.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, one final question. We've got a number here, but I'm just going to do one final question. We have currently separate IAM and GRC initiatives driven by IT and finance. How do we get them aligned? Hans, do you want to have a stab at that?
Yeah, also an interesting question, and unfortunately a rather common situation that we see quite often. It all begins by drive and understanding and sponsorship of the owners that are involved. Get them around the table and convince them that it's better for the organization to have a common architecture, a common idea, a common goal as the most effective way forward, you could say, and effective, I could say, simplest, cheapest, fastest way forward, because you build upon what you have already and you identify gaps and overlaps. Overlaps are a waste of money, and gaps you can fill if you have a focused effort on that. So I think it is to explore this overall process that facilitates the effective coordination and governance of the worlds, and it can be done. it requires a round table, because it's not so that the one side is more important than the other. I hope we have tried to convince you today that both sides are needed together. So start.
Thanks, Hans. I think what's interesting almost is that, you know, I talked about significant deficiency. If you are unfortunate enough to have a SOX audit issue or a significant deficiency, that might be just the catalyst you need to get the executives around the table and drive common sponsorship. So we're going to close off. Remember this, when it finishes, you're going to get this panel up. Please put a few words in, just the key, preferably a few nouns, key things that you think there. Thank you for all your questions. If you've got any others, would you have